Present.
Senator from Oklahoma.
First of all, let me thank my friend, the distinguished senator, for including me in his unanimous consent request. I am just briefly going to talk about an amendment. We all understand that the issue is going to come before this body to send activity into Syria, and I'm very much opposed to any kind of force in Syria. But if it happens, we want to be sure that there's some protection in there. So I have an amendment that even if my amendment passes, I will still oppose the effort of this president to send activity into Syria, and I believe which would precipitate a war. So my amendment's very simple. If the president takes military action against Syria, sequestration of our armed forces would be delayed for 1 year. Now, we're talking about the fiscal year where it would take another $52 billion out of our military. What Assad has done and continues to do is reprehensible, but the United States can't afford another war given the current state of our military. The threats from Syria and the Middle East are not emerging threats. These threats have been around for decades. We knew that they were there. There's nothing new about them. Yet the readiness and capabilities of our military continue to be decimated by drastic budget cuts. The 16 Air Force combat flying squadrons have been grounded. We finally, after 3 months, put them back in the air again. And right now, we know it costs more to get them back in a state of readiness than the money that was saved by grounding them for 3 months. Our naval fleet has been reduced to historically low levels, and the end strength of our ground forces have been cut by more than 100,000 personnel, and hundreds of thousands of DOD civilian employees have been furloughed. You know, just in my state of Oklahoma, in one of my installations, 14,000 civilian employees have been furloughed. Well, we can't have it both ways. Continue to cut the funding of our military while still expecting it to meet our national security requirements as military readiness and capabilities decline. We accept greater risk. And as I've always said, risk equals lives. Every time we have a hearing, we have our combatant commanders come in and talk about the risk. Risk means lives. As I've always said, risk equals lives, and allowing these cuts to continue while proposing to send our forces into harm's way is immoral and reprehensible. Over the last week, I've heard from a lot of the president and his administration about how any action in Syria will be limited. And I suggest no such thing as limited war. Once we decide to strike, we can't predict where we'll end up or how the situation might escalate. Let's not forget that we have troops currently on the ground in Jordan and in Turkey, Marines guarding our embassies, sailors and airmen stationed around the region. We've already heard that Iran is ordering its terrorist proxies to retaliate against by attacking the United States' interests in the region, including our embassy in Iraq. The State Department has ordered non-essential personnel to evacuate our embassy in Lebanon, and the threats of our forces are real. You know, I'd like to read for my colleagues excerpts from a letter that was written by two ladies, Rebecca Sanderlin and Molly Blake. Now, these are spouses of two of our servicemen. They're responding much more eloquently than I could ever hope to the immense hardships of our military is enduring under the sequestration, to the misguided belief that a military strike on Syria can be done in isolation, that it won't affect our troops and their families. Now, I'm going to ask that the entire letter be made a part of the record at this time.
Without objection.
And I'd like to quote, and I ask my colleagues to listen to the quote. These are the two ladies who are spouses of servicemen. They said, quote, "There's no such thing as a person-less war. Our military cannot afford for Americans to forget that wars and battles and military strikes are fought by troops, that troops are people, and that those people have families. In our military communities this summer, we couldn't even afford to pay federal employees for a 5-day work week. Military families can't get doctor's appointments and can't get counseling services needed to grapple with the problems that we already have, problems largely created by almost 12 years of war. Today, clinic hours are being slashed, along with pretty much every other service military family's needs. Walking around our communities lately, it doesn't look like we can afford much of anything, and certainly not a whole new war. I'm still quoting now these wives of our military men. And maybe someday we will be able to fight whole wars without using a single human, but today, in 2013, we can't have a surgical strike without someone saying where to drop the bombs or where to aim those missiles. And those planes that drop the bombs, the destroyers that carry the missiles, they have pilots, they have captains and crews. All humans, even the unmanned drones, have human pilots, and the psychological wear and tear on them is staggering. Planes take off from airfields in foreign lands and from aircraft carriers, both of which are staffed by thousands of American somebodies, just like those destroyer ships. At every turn in the military operation, you will find people, intel analysts, linguists, flight crews, and cooks. Even war plans rely on thousands of people who will be pulled to a new duty, which causes reshuffling far and wide in the military community, and this most definitely affects our military families. Again, that's a quote from two of the wives of our servicemen. I hope all my colleagues will read this letter. I hope they'll understand that the decisions we make this week about whether or not to go to war in Syria have a human dimension. If we expect the brave men and women in our military to go to foreign lands and risk their lives on our behalf, we have a moral obligation to ensure that they and their families have the support and the resources that are required. Sequestration has already inflicted more severe damage on our military, and we've now only a couple of weeks before another $52 billion is being slashed from an already devastated military budget. I've been clear, and that I don't support the President's call for military action in Syria. He still hasn't presented Congress and the American people with a plan for what he wants to accomplish, how he intends to accomplish it, or how he intends to pay for it. Will the President pay for this operation with more furloughs and by grounding more squadrons again? The CNO has already come forward and stated that if operations against Syria extend into October, he won't be able to afford it and will likely require supplemental funding from Congress. Furthermore, the President hasn't told us how a strike in Syria fits into a broader strategy for the Middle East. What we've decided to do is not just about Syria, it's bigger than that. This is about the growing threat from Iran, stability in the Middle East, and our commitment to Israel and allies, and our ability to respond to other contingencies that are there. You know, I recall knowing what was going to happen. This is 4.5 years ago. This is back when President Obama was first elected, his first election. And I knew that when he came out with his first budget, that he was going to do something devastating to the military. And so I put myself into Afghanistan, knowing with the tanks going back and forth that I'd be able to get the interest and the attention of the American people, and it worked. And so that very first budget, 4.5 years ago, he did away with our only fifth-generation bomber, the F-22, did away with our future combat system, the first ground capability increase in about 50 years, did away with our lift capacity, the C-17. And then the worst thing, which I hope doesn't turn out to be the worst thing, create the worst problem for America, did away with the ground-based operation in Poland. Now, that was just the first budget. That was 4.5 years ago. And since that time, he's, in his extended budget, taken $487 billion out of the military. And with sequestration, it'd be another $500 billion. And this just can't happen. You know, it's not just me that's saying this. People would expect it more from me. I am the ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I go over there and I work with these guys, and I know just the problems that they have. I would suggest that not just me, but Admiral Winnefeld, who is the second highest military guy and the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, could be he said, there could be for the first time in my career, this is an admiral speaking now, the second highest person in our military, instances where we may be asked to respond to a crisis and we will have to say we cannot. And then to go to the very top person, General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, quote, "Our military force is so degraded, so unready, it would be immoral to use force." I would only say this because we're going to be faced with this case, and I would say that I would be opposed to this even if my amendment to postpone the sequestration on the military for 1 year. However, even if that passes, I would still oppose this from taking place. I don't think many people in America realize what has happened under the Obama administration to our military. Well, I've just stated what has happened, and this is certainly not a time when we would increase and use force in Syria. Keep in mind, when General Dempsey said it would be immoral to use force, we are so degraded, and that's exactly what we'll be voting on in the next couple of days. With that, I yield the floor and suggest an absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.